I'm not really a fan of horror games. Despite this though, horror games are one of the most popular video game genres, and thus every once in a while my eyes are drawn to at least one of them. Dead Space 1 was released all the way back in 2008. In my opinion, this generation of consoles, the 360 generation, was one of the last eras that had widespread appeal of AAA horror titles. Games today, such as Days Gone, Last of Us Part 2, definitely implore horror aspects, but generally are just action games with horror laid on top. For just a brief moment though, I want to discuss my history with horror games. Ever since I started playing video games, at least from afar, I've been taking note at what horror games are doing. Not only do I think Dead Space represents a sort of key moment in AAA gaming history, but I just think that AAA horror games in general have an ability to cut through every other genre. So anyways, yeah, let's dive into the past. I am almost certain that many of you guys are cringing at me calling these games older horror. Even though Dead Space and the games that inspired it, like Resident Evil 4 all the way back in I think 2005, are much older than indie horror games that have been spiking up, for me at least, in terms of looking back, this era still feels like it was quite a while ago. Whether it's maybe 8 years ago with the original vamp of the Five Nights at Freddy's series, or 10 years ago with PewDiePie playing Amnesia. There's so many key aspects, but nonetheless, I think the big thing to note is how it was mostly Let's Players that really brought this new spike in specifically indie horror. Now, indie horror isn't important for the Dead Space conversation, but it is important for the conversation on my perspective of horror games. There was a time in which alongside free Steam games and Minecraft, the only other games that I played were things like Five Nights at Freddy's and other weird indie games that people like Markiplier played. Hell, this doesn't just go for indie games. This random Teens React video to the video game Outlast is something I oddly remember. It's probably only one of hundreds of random horror Let's Plays I remember from my childhood. As a kid, I definitely wouldn't have played this game, both because it was too scary and also I didn't have the hardware to do it on. But nonetheless, this slight exposure I got in how interesting games could interact with the player was something that caught my eye and definitely sparked my fascination for the future. I could definitely talk more about indie games and indie horror, but I think that's an entirely different discussion, and the whole purpose of what I'm talking about is just so that you know a little more about me, specifically in how horror has sort of always been an aspect of video games that I've admired. Now, anyways, how does this all connect back to Dead Space? Well, as I mentioned, Dead Space was released all the way back in 2008, so this was before the rise of indie horror. So that means there's a whole different contextualization I have to look at this game through. So as I critique this game, a lot of the evidence I'm going to be using is in this 1-hour interview with the game creator, Glenn Schofield. As you'll soon see though, the game was very much so inspired by the games of the time. It has a lot of action. The horror is slightly less psychological than you'd think, and because it's AAA, a lot of the specific aspects they focus on feel a lot more complex. But anyways, let's get right into the discussion of Dead Space itself, one of the last true AAA horror titles. Dead Space's story is very good, but it doesn't stick out to me as something that's amazing about the game. Quite honestly, the plot is very simple. You play as Isaac, an engineer. You and your team is tasked with fixing this huge ship, the USG Ishimura. But of course, things don't go as planned. You end up crash landing, a lot of your team is murdered, you are basically almost immediately pushed off on your own, and you barely interact with other people throughout the story. Because of this, I think there's a pretty big disconnect between what's going on in the ship and what's going on with Isaac. A lot of things are explained through video calls, and you can definitely piece together small things on the ship with the small things you're given, but at least personally, I think that the main story takes sort of a backseat throughout the entirety of the game. Other than like the first few missions and the very end of the game, you're not given that much in terms of exposition. There is a very deep story, and they created entire sort of religions and in-depth things that are meant to sort of be deep, but at least from a first playthrough, those things don't really pop out. And for the most part, you're just Isaac running around the ship. The main thing that's linking the story together is that you're basically just fixing things throughout the ship. There's about 12 missions, and in each one you're like doing a small task. These tasks are things like fixing the air filter or something. You're basically trying to restore the ship's functionality in hopes that you can eventually escape. All the creepy things that are going on in the ship aren't really explained that well until, again, the very end of the game, and so I at least would say that the main narrative isn't good. But something that is good is the ambiance. As I mentioned earlier, the game is very heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4. The game director said this about that.
Some of my influences to make Dead Space from the game industry was definitely the Resident Evil series. And Resident Evil 4 had just come out. One of the things I would say to the team is we're going to make Resident Evil in space. And you got it right away. I find that Resident Evil 4 is one of my top 5 games of all time. And I just like the mood. The mood was oppressive sometimes. It was dreadful, but it was, I don't know, I just got caught up in it.
If you even just look at Resident Evil 4's gameplay versus this game's, you can definitely see that there's clear inspiration. That goes for both gameplay and atmosphere. Now, I'll be honest, I think both of these games sort of lack in that horror aspect that we've seen grow throughout the years, primarily because they rely a lot more on action. At the end of the day, it's a AAA game, and so a lot of the gameplay elements, like the combat, have to be a lot more action-based to engage the player in a way that only AAA games can do. But nonetheless, there's still this very dark and depressive atmosphere that I found myself absolutely loving. Not to mention the amazing enemies. Although I'll discuss this more in sort of the combat section, as you can see in this clip right here, the Necromorphs really use the environment to their advantage. This one literally goes up into a vent and then drops down right in front of you. It's fucking horrific. Also, unlike the Resident Evil franchise, I feel like the main character, Isaac, is a lot more of a sort of everyday person, which is especially helped by his face being shielded for most of the game. The tools that he uses to kill enemies aren't actually made to kill the Necromorphs. They're simply tools that you'd find along the ship. This is something that the game director explains in the interview as well.
This guy wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a fighter, he was an engineer. And I wanted you to feel like it was just a person, like you are. He's an everyday worker put in a situation that he didn't want to be in. And that's why all the weapons are his tools that he worked on. That's why his suit it's an engineer's suit, right? But he had to adapt it into ways to take these on. But the whole idea of Isaac is an everyday guy. And that's why he wasn't in charge of everything. And he wasn't in the military. And he found his guns and he found his weapons and he used tools. And that was the big deal with Isaac, is just trying to make him an everyday engineer.
So yeah, in my opinion, the entire reason why the horror works to begin with is because Isaac as a character feels somewhat unprepared. By utilizing your surroundings, you're actually able to get out of the situation. And I think at the end of the day, it's this that makes this game survival horror. Not to mention, this all just amplifies the themes even more. The only reason why the horror works for me is because, yeah, at the end of the day, you're working against terrible odds. And even though I don't think the game is too difficult, the way that you actually have to deal with the enemies only exemplifies the horror themes even more. But I guess I'll discuss that again more in the combat section. Before we continue though, I want to quickly mention the remake that they're making of this game. I remember the day that they announced the remake. It was really great to see everybody hyped up for something that honestly I thought that many people forgot about. The footage that you're seeing right now is sort of early gameplay footage, but I feel like the big debate is, does this game even need a remake? I think that the visuals look really amazing, but they don't really match that late 2000s sort of grungy Xbox 360 graphics that we got with the original. For instance, here's the visuals for the original game. I actually don't think the game looks bad at all, and for that reason, I don't think the game needs a remake in terms of visuals, but the reason why I think the remake is actually a good thing is because it'll bring more eyes to this amazing game, and who knows, we might get another Dead Space, or just generally more excitement for AAA horror titles. I mean, sure, I'd much rather get a new Dead Space game than a remake, but at the end of the day, a remake's better than nothing, right? Anyways, I really quickly just want to talk about the pacing of the game. As even though the story, visuals, and ambiance do a good job at heightening the horror, I think the pacing of this game makes it just work so well. Okay, so this game is of course filled with sort of individual small moments and small scares like you're seeing on screen right now, and these small moments really do a good job at adding up to the eventual sort of release of combat. In this way, the pacing is extremely slow, and that's completely because it's a horror title. As you can see right now, here's the sort of climactical big battle. There's so many enemies that you have to fight, and you're constantly switching through weapons and being completely scared. And I gotta say, if this game was just second-to-second combat, then these horror moments wouldn't be that eventful. Because you have these slow moments, you're able to actually be scared prepared when a big combat battle starts. Then there's also sort of small things to do in between big gameplay moments. For instance, you upgrade your weapons like you're seeing on screen right now. You basically collect these power nodes and you're able to spend them on upgrading your weapon. I don't really like this system though, primarily because you're not really given that many nodes, and by the end of the game, I very barely upgraded my weapons. The game is so short that these things don't really matter, but nonetheless, when you actually are able to upgrade your weapon, you feel at least a little more comfortable in your environment. There's a lot of different types of weapons to use as well, and I do think that some are more gimmicky than others, and then some are just universally amazing that you're able to use in almost any situation. But nonetheless, I'm going to refrain from talking about this further and save it for the combat section of this video. Other fun parts of this game are things like this 0G section. You're able to fly around, and it's really fun to fight enemies in this environment. Many puzzles actually use this mechanic, and I really like the game for that. It makes the puzzles a lot more interesting. There's also some segments in which you have a limited amount of oxygen. It allows the game to have some sort of tension-filled moments that aren't just you fighting enemies. Not to mention there's tons of other environmental hazards to be careful of. Because of these hazards that aren't directly inflicted by combat, I think the game is a lot more enjoyable, and it makes it so that there's a lot more things on the ship that you should be scared of. Also, overall, as you play, there's tons of these small sort of scary moments, or things that add to the ambiance of the ship. I talked a lot about these earlier, but I also think it's a good thing to mention how this game throws these things throughout. Again, it keeps you constantly on edge. Now I guess I'll quickly mention the shop system. You can basically transfer things from your inventory to a safe and then also buy things in the shop. As you play, you unlock more things that you can buy in the shop. Some things are really good, such as weapon upgrades and new weapons, and then some are for basic survival, things like health kits and air cans. Saving up your money and buying something big feels really good, but it's also good that the game allows you to buy your own supplies, things like health kits and air cans. Sometimes I think the game of micromanaging your inventory is a little annoying, but nonetheless I don't really mind too much, and that's because the game does a really good job at giving you resources. Okay, so this is a pretty small thing, but I really noticed it throughout my playthrough. As you collect items, it almost feels like the items are very specially granted for you. There's like 8 different weapons, each with their own ammo type, but the game always gives you like the perfect ammo in that moment. It never encourages you to use one gun over the other, but it's still really fair and even. Also, every single enemy drops something, whether it's ammo, a health pack, or just some really weird thing. Because of this, whenever you're engaged in combat, it never feels like you're gonna go out of it worse off than you were before. This is a really small thing, but I think it makes the survival aspect of this game a lot nicer to people like me. I'm not a huge fan at all of survival games, even lesser of a fan of survival horror, but nonetheless, I never really felt like the game was gimping me out of something. The experience was always fair. I played on medium difficulty, and I slightly wish that I played on hard, but nonetheless, I still had a really great time with the difficulty in the game. They don't overdo it with the sort of survival inventory management. Anyways, now I just want to really briefly talk about some big set pieces. The one that you're seeing right now is one that's really early in the game. It's pretty fun and it does set you up for this sort of segment later. The spectacle is really good because there's very few moments like this, and so you're really able to take it in. Then there's this boss fight, which was likely my least favorite in the game. It was really annoying. I ended up even having to restart it because I didn't have enough resources. The big problem being that you have to waste a ton of ammo on this one guy, and if you're conserving it and being really careful with not buying too much ammo like I was, then you're gonna basically fail and you have to restart and buy a ton more ammo. I mean, it's not like he's the worst boss fight ever, but it's still pretty bad. Anyways, then you also have this weird tentacle sequence. This is something that the director talks a lot about in the video that I showed earlier. I'd highly recommend watching this if you want to know a lot more about game design and whatnot. Overall, I think these big sequences do a good job at giving a very obvious climax to a lot of the tension that builds as you play. Without them, then the natural story structure of rising action, climax, and then falling action wouldn't really work. But I think that all just generally connects to why I find this game pretty scary. Now, I want to say this right now, this is nowhere near the scariest game I've played. In fact, I just want to say that this game fails in many ways at being a horror game, primarily because it has a lot of action. But to talk more about that, I want to deep dive into how this game really scares you. Let's talk about the horror. Okay, so as I've repeated multiple times throughout this video already, the horror is a lot more diluted in this game because all the main gameplay is based around this sort of action combat structure. But nonetheless, there's some pretty scary moments throughout. So I guess to sort of be able to explain why I find this game scary, I'll show a few instances in which I was absolutely freaking the fuck out. You see, I originally played through the first 4 chapters or so of this game, to then put it down and pick it back up again and play from the beginning quite recently. But the very first time I played, I remember this one room that you're seeing on screen right now. Inside is very bright and white, colors that are normally correlated with safe rooms. And so I felt pretty safe, until of course the lights go out, you hear a bunch of monsters around you, and you're thrown into a very early combat scene. Because it's really early on, I felt really unprepared, and because of that I had to pause and take a real deep breath. On screen is just another instance of this. I thought this would be a regular enemy, and so I started taking it down like I usually do. Next thing you know, I'm hitting it on the ground, and then it starts to come back up. You see, this part is pretty far into the game, and so they thought it would be a pretty fun idea to throw an invincible enemy at you. When I realized that you could not kill this enemy, I was so fucking scared. I could literally like feel goosebumps on me. It was a new terror that you couldn't deal with in the regular method. This sort of fear happens every time that they throw a new enemy type at you. Later, they incorporate the invincibility into some pretty fun puzzles as well. So yeah, this is one of my favorite instances of the game just scaring your socks off. Finally, there's this part in which everything was going normal, and then all of a sudden, things start to go bad. Monsters pop out of the roof, and I get so fucking scared I have to pause the game. I'm pretty sure I paused the game in each one of the 3 instances that I showed, but seriously, nothing for me shows I'm scared quite like me having to literally pause the game. When a video game scares me so much that I have to pause or I'm just completely terrified, then that game and that moment will definitely stick with me. Not to mention, this fear has an ability of heightening the game experience, unlike any other genre. Here, let me explain another scenario. In the video game The Last of Us, one of the main things the game tries to do is make you, the player, care for Ellie, the girl that you're trying to lead across the country. So in one of these very tense moments, they separate you from her, and they surround you by like the most amount of zombies that the game ever does. It's pitch black, it's absolutely hectic, and you're scared as fuck. And so when this zombie ran out at me, pinned me against the wall, I was so scared I paused and literally took like a 5-minute break from the game. You could argue that this affected me so much because it was 2 AM, but truly this moment worked so well because now every other time that I was with Ellie, I was so happy to be with her because it was so much better than being alone and having to deal with really scary monsters. I could definitely list like a dozen other instances in which video games properly use horror to make the game experience just so much better, but truly at the end of the day, I think you guys already get what I'm trying to say. You see, horror games of course are able to spark this sort of primal instinct in players. As other games need to get really complex plot lines and lore to draw somebody in horror games, the simple threat of something insanely scary in front of you instantly immerses me at least. And yes, Dead Space had these moments. For instance, again, that invincible enemy. I was completely drawn into the game at this moment. It was a completely new problem, something new that I had to work my way around. And because it was so scary, it was so urgent and on my mind. Yet even though Dead Space is able to succeed in these characteristics of horror, I think it fails in 2 other ways. First of all, it doesn't really utilize that much psychological horror. This isn't a huge problem, especially considering that if you look into it, you can definitely find some deeper lore, but nonetheless, nothing really grabbed me on my first playthrough. Secondly, as I've said over and over, this is an action game, and because of that, whenever something scary happens, the way that you respond at it is by shooting at things. Even though many elements of the combat system do sort of heighten this scariness, for instance, it's really slow and methodical, and every single enemy you have to handle a different way. This makes the game really scary, but nonetheless, you're just shooting at monsters. Many of you guys are probably confused at me right now. You see, many of the other games I mentioned that are very scary involve you shooting at monsters, but let me describe the big difference. You see, up until the end of, let's say, The Last of Us, a group of zombies was similarly scary. I never really felt like I was ever in control of the situation, and thus whenever I fought a zombie from the very start of the game to the very end, I felt the same amount of terror and fear. As they gave you more abilities, they made the zombies even scarier and more powerful. Yet in Dead Space, by the end, I did very much so feel like an all-powerful being. There were many encounters at the end that I really didn't have to care about at all. I was shredding these things, and because of that, there's many aspects of the game that I stopped finding scary. But in my opinion at least, that's because in a horror game, you're basically doing one thing that scares you over and over again. And so eventually, of course, you'll reach that point in which that action is no longer scary. For instance, FNAF 1. When I go to revisit that game for fun, I no longer find it scary because the jump scares, well, they don't scare me anymore. But in other games that have horror aspects sort of laid throughout, for instance, again, The Last of Us, those games have other aspects of the game, and so the horror is able to stay continuously fresh. Dead Space, sadly, though, does sort of get less scary over time. Because of that, I'd say that the first half of this game is like the very best that horror can ever get. You're constantly scared at the new things that they're throwing at you, but again, eventually it gets old. Also, the game overall is short enough, only about 8 hours, so I didn't really care that much. The good thing though is that the combat is amazing, so by the end of the game, even though you might not be necessarily scared, you'll still have a great time shooting off the hordes of necromorphs. So I guess now let's discuss the combat. Okay, so one thing that I'm very surprised I haven't mentioned yet in this video is how the UI works. So basically on Isaac's back, there's both a health bar and also a stasis bar. And so quickly in combat, you can very easily see what your health is at and how much stasis you have left. Stasis allows you to control and move things around the environment, and even freeze enemies, which helps out a lot in combat. From the very start, these things are shown to sort of immerse you more in the world. You don't have to open up a menu. There's no large health bars or stamina meters on your screen. Everything is tied directly into the game world. This is helped even more by how things like the map and inventory are handled in game. Everything seems like Isaac is controlling it. Nothing's an out-of-world menu. It all makes sense inside of the game world, so you're never pulled out of the world in which these creepy monsters are crawling around. This heightens the tension much further, as many times in combat, if you need to open up your menu, you're still risking time because it doesn't pause the game. It's the same as though if Isaac was pulling up a menu. This only furthers the immersion, and I think specifically because it's a horror game, this works so much better. Oh yeah, and also with a button press, you can basically see the perfect waypoint to where you're going. It projects itself upon the floor, which makes navigating the ship a lot easier. But anyways, that's just about the UI. The combat's its own other thing. The combat, being inspired off of games like Resident Evil 4, is very slow and methodical. Yet from the very start, the second that you get your first weapon, you're shown that you have to cut off the limbs of the enemy. You can't just shoot their body with an assault rifle and kill them. You have to literally dismember them until they're actually dead. Some enemies you have to deal with a little differently, yet for the most part, this is how you deal with enemies in almost every single combat encounter. There's some basic human-like enemies that stand up and you just have to cut off their limbs. There's these weird ball guys that lay up these big spikes. Some enemies are really fast, some are slow, some have these big explosive bulbs. Just overall, there's a huge variety of enemies throughout the game. The best is when they combine multiple enemies into one battle. You have to think about which one you have to take out first. Originally, I was going to list off the names of all of these enemies, but for the most part, I think it's pretty basic because you're just cutting off their limbs. That's all you have to know. That's how simple it is. But where it isn't simple are the weapons. There's a good handful of weapons that you can use. You can only have 4 on you at a time, but when you're at a shop, you can buy any other weapon that you want. For the sake of this video, I decided to try out every single weapon that I got my hands on. Some of them are very gimmicky and much less useful than others, and then others are very, very powerful. But first, I'll just talk about the basic weapons. First of all, you have basic guns like the plasma cutter and line gun. The plasma cutter is smaller, and the line gun is good at sweeping large cuts. The pulse rifle is a pretty basic rifle. Because you're cutting off limbs, it's a little less good than you'd think, but nonetheless, when you need to deal a lot of damage and a lot of knockback, it's very good. The Ripper I don't really like too much. Same thing with the contact gun. But the force gun and flamer are both very good. The flamethrower is very useful. It deals a lot of damage, but my personal favorite fourth weapon is the force gun. It absolutely decimates enemies. It pushes them back far, and I found myself getting a lot of ammo for it. I think the game does a good job at letting you play around with these different weapons, but nonetheless, I'm almost certain that every player will sort of find their niche. They'll find the few weapons that they like a lot, and then they'll use that throughout the game. Luckily, the game doesn't punish you for that. It never gives you ammo for a weapon that you don't currently have in your inventory, and so everything that you pick up along the map is always useful to you. The combat itself is also very fun. Again, as I've said over and over, this game is inspired off of Resident Evil 4. In Resident Evil 4, you literally have to stand still to shoot at enemies. This game doesn't really debilitate you in that level, but nonetheless, when you aim down sight, you're very slow, and there's often times in which you have to run away from enemies. You have to be the perfect distance away, and knowing when to attack and when to run away and when to use your stasis ability to pause enemies, it's a real fun system. But I think the overarching thing to remember is that this is a horror game, and because of this, the enemies have to be really scary. Yet because shooting at enemies becomes sort of second nature, the enemies start feeling a little less scary. This is what I explained in the horror section of this video, but I think it's very important because that doesn't really hurt the combat. The combat is always fun. In terms of combat, the game does a really good job. But again, the game is trying to tread this line between being creepy and action-based. And because of that, I think the flashiness of the combat is sort of debilitating. And because of that, I wish the game maybe stuck a little more to the survival elements. The game is very survival based, but by the end that wasn't as prominent. I think I'll revisit this topic if I ever play through Dead Space 2, or if I ever review a Resident Evil game, but for now I think all you have to know is that the combat is very fun, but the biggest issues I had with the game was how the combat and the horror clash. The closest thing the game comes to fixing this is by giving you much tougher enemies to fight, but again, only to a certain extent does this actually scare you. Your heart might go up a little, but nothing is quite scary like the enemies from the start of the game, in which they're absolutely horrifying and you know nothing about them. Getting your foothold in the world and becoming a little less scared is interesting, but again, wasn't exactly what I was expecting. Anyways, Dead Space is one of the best games that I've played recently, and I highly recommend it. The combat is very fun, and the horror did a good job at scaring me throughout the game. But anyways, let's get into the conclusion of this video. So don't get me wrong, Dead Space is definitely one of the best games that I've played recently. In fact, it's the first horror game I've played to score a solid 8 out of 10. The combat is very unique and definitely carries this game, and the way that they express horror in this game is something that only video games can do. This is the best example of how video games can contribute to horror in a much different way than movies or TV shows. They truly use the interactive nature of video games to its full advantage, and because of that, again, Dead Space is one of the best horror games I've ever played. It's so competent in what it's doing, and even though I think that around the mid part of the game, things like the pacing, the general horror aspects take a little bit of a dip, you definitely won't be disappointed by the end. All of its gameplay elements are so precise. It's one of those games that you play and you're truly able to see the main idea that the lead developers had, and I would very, very highly recommend this game to anybody that's interested in horror or just interested in video games in general. Something that I mentioned earlier was how this game just oozes energy from the 360 generation, and I think because of that, if you're ever going to go back to, let's say, the 360 or PS3, this is one of those games that really defines that generation because of how competent and well put together it is. But really quickly, I want to say a few brief words about this channel itself. So first of all, I kind of want to apologize about my upload schedule. This last month has been very busy with school because of course it's the end of the school year, and I've had a lot of work to do. But very soon it's going to be summer, and so I'm going to start working on both putting out more videos, and most importantly, there's many video games that I have been putting off playing until summer. Although a lot of these are just for personal enjoyment, if I can, then I'll try to make a video on them. Also, something that I said in the last video is that I've sort of been on a slight burnout path. You can probably see this on my website as I've been posting a lot less articles, and also that's again because of the school year sort of coming to an end, and so of course it's harder for me to find time to sort of write my own articles. But the big thing I want to mention is that the next video coming out is not going to be a review, but it's going to have as much effort put into it as, let's say, my Ghost of Tsushima video. I'm not too sure how long it's going to be yet. I'll try to make it fairly lengthy, but I'm going to talk about one specific aspect of the video game, not the entire video game itself. I think that's important because the way that I make videos doesn't really work well with reviews. I mean, yeah, I've been primarily making reviews, but I think the natural format of having to talk about every single aspect of a video game and sort of make my mind up on every single aspect, it's very hard, especially with video games in which many times only half the aspects of the game are actually set in my mind as something that I really like or dislike. Oftentimes there's things that games do that I don't care too much about, and because of that, hopefully the next video, it will both be a lot more direct and a lot more specific, but more importantly, it'll have a lot more passion put into it. The Valorant video that I made honestly didn't have a lot of passion. This video had a bit of passion. It was sort of going back to the thing that I like to do the most in videos, and hopefully the next video I make and put out will have the most passion that I've ever put into a video. Oh, I also might make like a short little 4-minute video about G Fuel like I did with the G Fuel crepes in the meantime, just for fun. Honestly, I'd rather put out like a 4-minute silly video in the meantime than put out nothing. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and I would very, very highly recommend looking at my other content. Specifically, the Ghost of Tsushima video and the Miles Morales video are probably the two best things that I've ever made. So if you haven't watched those, please take a look. I love those videos so much. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Telephone.